Hey everyone. So today we kind of had a first little bout of winter trying to snow on us, and had my neighbor point out, "Is that your new roof flying away?" Yeah, that is. So I went, collected it all up, and neighbor's watching me, and I get it all back. Start getting it all set up. Neighbor's watching me. End up falling off the roof. I get a, "You okay?" "Yeah, I just got to get this done so it doesn't get too bad on the snow." It's kind of funny. Anyway, you guys didn't call here my problems. So this is Jim Butcher's White Knight, Book 9 of the Dresden Files. What we're on is Chapter 39. Let's go ahead here, kind of jump in, get this started. Kind of want to find out what is going to happen here with Dresden and Ramirez. Let's start into 39. "I knew it," Ramirez snarled. "I knew it was a setup." He turned to look at me and then blinked. It was only then that I realized that I had my teeth barred in a wide smile. "That's right," I told him. "It is." I have seen some real pros open gateways to the Never Never. The youngest of the summer queens of the Sidhe could open them so smoothly that you'd never see it happening until it was over. I'd seen Cowell open ways to the Never Never as casually and easily as a screen door, with the gate itself being barely noticeable until it vanished a few seconds later, leaving behind it the same musty smell now flooding the cavern. I couldn't do it that smoothly, or with that much subtlety. But I could do it just as quickly and just as effectively. I spun on my heels as the ghouls flooded the cavern and plunged into the gathered members of the White Court in a killing frenzy. "Go!" Ramirez shouted. "I can't run away. I'll hold them. Get out of here!" "Get over yourself and cover my back," I snarled. I gathered my will again, shifting my staff into my right hand. The runes on the staff blazed to life, and I pointed the staff across my body at the air 4 feet off the cavern floor. Then I released my gathered will, focused by my intentions and the energies aligned in my staff, and shouted, "Appetardum!" Furious, golden and scarlet light flooded down the length of wood, searing a seam in reality. I drew the staff from left to right, drawing a line of fire in the air. And after a heartbeat, that line expanded, burning up like a fire running up a curtain, down like rain sluicing down a car window, and left behind it a gateway, an opening from the Wraith deeps to the Never Never. The gate opened on a cold and frozen woodland scene. Silvery moonlight slipped through, and a freezing wind gusted, blowing powdery white snow into the cavern, substance of the spirit world, which transformed into clear, if chilly, gelatin, the ectoplasm left behind when spirit matter reverted to its natural state. There was a stir of shadows, and then my brother burst through the opening, saber in one hand, sawed-off shotgun in the other. Thomas was dressed in heavy biker leather and body armor, with honest-to-God chainmail covering his biker jacket. His hair was tied back in a tail, and his eyes were blazing with excitement. "Perry!" "Take your time," I barked back at him. "We're not in a crisis or anything." "The others are right, but look out!" I spun in time to see one of the ghouls bound into the air and sail toward me. The claws on both its hands and feet extended to rip and slash. Ramirez shouted and flung one of his green blasts at the thing. It caught the ghoul at the apex of its flight, and simply bored a hole the size of a garbage can in its lower abdomen. The ghoul landed in a splatter of gore and fury. It kept fighting, though its legs flopped around like seals' tails, of no use. I sprang back, or at least I tried to spring. Opening a gate to the Never Never is not complicated, but it isn't easy either. And between that and all the fighting I'd done, I was beginning to bump up against my physical limits. My legs wobbled, and my spring was more like a lazy, hot, and motionless end of summer. Thomas dragged me the last 6 inches, or I wouldn't have avoided the ghoul's claws. He extended his arm, shotgun in hand, and blew the ghoul's head off its shoulders in a spray of flying bits of bone and horn, and a mist of horrible black blood. After which the ghoul seized him with one arm and began raking its talon at him with the other. The terrible power of the mangled ghoul was enormous. Links of chainmail snapped and went flying, and Thomas let out a scream of surprise and outrage. "What the hell?" he snarled. He dropped the shotgun and took off the ghoul's attacking arm with his saber. Then he broke the grip of the last clawed hand and flung the ghoul's body away from him. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, recovering the shotgun. I said. "That was one." "Harry," Ramirez said, backpedaling as best he could with a wounded leg, and bumped into me. I steadied him before he lost his balance. That damned knife was still sticking out of his calf. A dozen more ghouls were charging us. Everything slowed down, the way it sometimes does when fresh adrenaline shifts me into overdrive. The cavern had gone insane. The ghouls had been there for maybe 30 seconds, but there were several dozen of them at least, with more pouring out of the neat oval gate on the other side of the cavern. The ghouls had apparently attacked everyone with equal amounts of ferocity and fury. More of them had poured into Malvoran and Skavis contingent than the Wraith side, but that might have been a function of simple numbers and proximity. The vampires, most of them unarmed and unprepared for a fight, had been taken off guard. That doesn't mean as much to vamps as it does to regular folks. But the walls had been splattered with pale blood where the ghouls had rushed among them, and the battle, now raging, was horrific. In one spot, Lady Malvora ripped the arm from a ghoul's socket, her skin gone marble white and hard-looking, and proceeded to beat it about the head and shoulders with its own detached limb. The ghoul went down with a shattered skull, but 4 more of the creatures buried the White Court noblewoman under their weight and power, and literally ripped her to pieces in front of my eyes. Elsewhere, a male vampire picked up an 8-foot-long sofa and slammed its end down onto a pair of ghouls, ripping at the body of the fallen thrall. Still elsewhere, Lord Skavis had rallied a number of his to him, standing off against the maddened ghouls like a rock ignoring a flash flood, for the moment at least. Other sights weren't nearly so pleasant. A vampire, trying to flee, tripped over a human thrall, a girl no more than 18, and dealt her a blow of his fist in pure frustration, snapping her neck. He was brought down by ghouls a breath later. Elsewhere, other vampires seemed to have lost control of their demonic hunger completely, and they had thrown down whatever thralls they could seize, with no regard for gender or for what their particular favorite food might be. One thrall, writhing under a Skavis, was screaming and pushing her limbs and thumbs into her own eyes. Another shuddered under the fear compulsion of a Malvora, clearly in the midst of a seizure or heart attack, right up until a tide of ghouls overran predator and prey alike. The Wraith didn't seem to be as wholly frenzied as the other houses, or maybe they'd just eaten more today. I saw only a couple of thralls downed by them, being torn out of their clothes and ravaged on the stone. Like those near Lord Skavis, a core of organization had formed around Laura and her father. Someone, I saw a flash of Justine's terrified face, was holding a little air horn up and triggering it wildly. I spotted Vito Malvora charging the ghouls around his fallen aunt, and watched as he threw himself on the remains with an inhuman howl and began feasting beside the creatures who had killed her. It had taken seconds for intrigue to devolve into insanity in 1,000 simultaneously nightmarish-inducing vignettes, none of which I could afford to think significant, save one. The dozen ghouls plunging directly toward me like a football team on a kickoff, huge and fast and furious, charging me on a straight line from the enemy gate. For a second, I thought I saw a dark shape in that gate, the suggestion of an outlined hood and cloak. It might have been Cowell. I'd have hit him with all the fire I could call if I'd had a second to spare, but I didn't. I brought up my shield as the ghouls came over the floor, and held it fast as the leader of the pack slammed into it in a flare of blue and silver light and a cloud of sparks. The ghoul only howled and began slamming at the barrier with his fists. Every single one hit with the energy of a low-speed car crash. And even with my nifty new bracelet, I could feel the surge of power I needed to keep the shield steady when each of the blows came thundering down. Boots thudded behind me. Someone was shouting, "Bam! Bam! Bam!" The ghoul slammed against my shield, and it was almost painful effort to hold it. "Justine!" Thomas screamed. I wouldn't be able to hold this ghoul off for long, which was all right, because the other 11 were going to go right around my shield while he forced me to hold it steady against him and tear me into tiny pieces and eat me. Hopefully in that order. Bootsteps thudded behind me, and a voice barked. A second ghoul, several steps in front of the rest, flung itself around my shield, but was intercepted by Ramirez. It leapt at him and hit that gelatinous-looking green cloud of a shield he used. What happened to the ghoul as its speed carried its whole mass all the way through the shield does not bear thinking on. But Ramirez was going to need new clothes. Bam! 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 Murphy screamed, "Harry! Thomas! Ramirez! Down!" I dropped and dragged Carlos down with me, lowering my shield as I went. Thomas hit the ground a fraction of a second after I did, and the world came apart in thunder. Sound hammered at my head and ears, and I found myself screaming in pain and shock before I ground my teeth and shot a quick glance behind me, trying not to lift my head any higher than I had to. Murphy knelt on the ground by my feet in her dark fatigues, body armor, black baseball cap, and amber safety glasses. She had a weird little rectangular gun about the size of a big box of chocolates held to one shoulder. It had a tiny little barrel, one of those little red dot optical sights, and Murphy's cheek was laid on it, one eye aligned with the sight as she poured automatic fire into the oncoming ghouls in neat, chattering bursts that ripped the ghoul that had been pounding on my shield into a spray of broken bits. It went over backward, thrashing one arm and howling in agony. Beside Murphy, playing Clifford, the big red dog, to her, Emily, Elizabeth, was Hendricks. A huge red-headed enforcer was also kneeling and firing, but the gun he held on his shoulder was approximately the size of an intercontinental ballistic missile and spat out a stream of tracer rounds that ripped into the attacking creatures with a vengeance. Several men I recognized from Marcone's organization were lined up next to him, all firing. So were several more men I didn't recognize, but whose clothing and equipment were sufficiently different to make me think they were freelancers, hired for the job. A few more were still pouring through the open gate and into the cavern. The ghouls were hardy as hell, but there was a difference between shrugging off a few rounds from a sidearm and wading through the disciplined hail of assault weapon fire that Marcone's people laid down on them. Had it been one man firing at one ghoul, it might have been different, but it wasn't. There were at least 20 of them shooting into the packed mass, and they kept shooting, even after the targets were thrashing on the ground, until their guns were empty. Then they reloaded and returned to firing. Marcone had given his men the instructions I'd advised. and I imagined the guns he had hired on must have been used to facing supernatural threats of this sort as well. Marcone was nothing if not resourceful. Murphy stopped shooting and screamed something at me. But it wasn't until Marcone stepped forward into the peripheral vision of the armed gunmen and held up a hand with a closed fist that they all stopped firing. For a second, nothing but a high, heavy tone buzzed in my ears, making me deaf to the other sounds in the cavern. The air was full of the sewer stench of wounded ghoul and the sharp scent of burning cordite. A swath of stone floor 10 yards across and 30 deep had just been carpeted in pureed ghoul. The fight was still going on around us, but the main force of the ghouls was concentrating on the hard-pressed vampires. We'd bought ourselves a temporary, quiet spot, but it couldn't last. "Harry!" Murphy screamed over the merely horrific cacophony of the slaughter. I gave her a thumbs up. I pushed myself to my feet. Someone gave me a hand up, and I took it gratefully, until I saw that it was Marcone, dressed in his black fatigues, holding a shotgun in his other hand. I jerked my fingers away as if he were more disgusting than the things fighting and dying all around us. His cold green eyes wrinkled at the corners. "Dresden, if it's all right with you, I think it would be prudent to retreat back through the gate." That was probably a very smart idea. The gate was 6 feet away from me. We could pull up stakes, hop through, and close it behind us. Gates to the spirit world paid absolutely no attention to trivial things like geography. They obeyed laws of imagination, patterned thought. Even if Cowell was back there, he wouldn't be able to open a gate to the same place as mine, because he didn't think like me, feel like me, or share my intent and purpose. Seeing fallout from the war with the Red Court had convinced me that running when you didn't have to fight was a really great idea. In fact, the Merlin had written a letter to the wardens directing them to do so, rather than lose even more of our dwindling combat resources. If we hung around much longer, no one was getting out of this abattoir. Thomas's sword came down on a thrashing ghoul, and he shouted with desperation bordering on madness. "Justine!" He spun around. "Harry, help me, please!" Leaving was smart. But my brother wasn't leaving. Not without the girl. So I wasn't leaving without her, either. Come to think of it, there were a whole lot of people who didn't need to be here. And in point of fact, there were some damned compelling reasons to take them with us when we went. Those reasons didn't make it any less dangerous, and they sure as hell didn't make the idea any less scary. But that didn't stop them from existing. Without Laura's peace initiative, fronted by her puppet father, the White Court would pitch in more heavily with the Reds than they already had. If I didn't get Laura and her puppet out, what was already a grim war with the vampires would quite possibly become an impossible one. That was a damned good reason to stay. But it wasn't the one that kept me there. I saw another ghoul tear into a helpless, unresisting thrall, closed my eyes for a second, and realized that if I did nothing to save as many as I could, I would never leave this cavern. Oh, sure, I might get out alive, but I'd be back here every time I closed my eyes. "Dresden!" Marcone shouted. "I agreed to an extraction, not to a war." "A war's all we've got," I shouted back. "We've got to get Wraith out of this in one piece, or the whole thing was for nothing, and no one pays you off." "No one will pay me off if I'm dead either," Marcone said. I snarled and stepped closer, getting into Marcone's face. Hendricks rolled a half step toward me and growled. Murphy seized a huge man by one enormous paw, did something that involved his wrist and his index finger, and with a grunt, Hendricks dropped to one knee while Murphy held one of his arms, out straight behind him, and angled painfully upward. "Take it easy, big guy," Murphy said. "Someone might get hurt." "Don't move," Marcone snarled to his men, not to me. His eyes never wavered from mine. "Yes, Dresden." "I could tell you to do it. Or I'd strand you all in the Never Never on the way home. I said quietly. I could tell you to help me, or I'd close the gate, and we'd all die here. I could even tell you to do it, or I'd burn you to ashes where you stand. But I won't tell you that. Marcone narrowed his eyes. No? No. Threats won't deter you. We both know that. I can't force you to do anything, and we both know that, too. I jerked my head at the cavern. People are dying, John. Help me save them. God, please help me save them. Marcone's head rocked back as if I'd slapped him. After a second, he asked, Who do you think I am, wizard? Someone who can help them, I said. Maybe the only one. He stared at me with empty, opaque eyes. Then he said very quietly, Yes. I felt a fierce smile stretch my mouth and turned to Ramirez at once. Stay here with these guys and hold the gate. Who are these people? Ramirez asked. Later. I whirled back to Marcone. Ramirez is with the council, like me. Keep him covered and hold the gate. Marcone pointed at several of the men. You! Guard this man and hold the gate. He pointed out several more. You, and you. Start rounding up anyone close enough to us to get out without undue risk and help them through. Men leaped to obey, and I felt impressed. I'd never seen Marcone quite like this before. Animated, decisive, and totally confident despite the nightmare all around. There was a power to it, something that brought order to the terrifying chaos around us. I could see why men followed him, how he had conquered the underworld of Chicago. One of the hired guns cut loose with a burst of fire, still shockingly loud enough to make me flinch. You know what else? I asked Marcone. I don't really need this cave. Neither do you. Marcone narrowed his eyes at me, then nodded once and said something over his shoulder to one of the hired guns. Dresden, I would appreciate it if you would ask the sergeant to release my employee. Murph, I complained, can't you pick on someone your own size? I took a second to admire Hendrick's expression, but said, We need him with his arms still attached, please. Murphy eased up on the pressure and then released Hendricks's arm. The big man eyed Murphy, rubbing his arm, but regained his feet and his enormous machine gun. Harry, Thomas said, voice tight. We need to move. Yeah, I said. Thomas, Murphy, and we needed mass. Hendricks with me. Hendricks checked that Marcone, who nodded. Follow me, I told them. Stay. What are you doing, Marcone? Marcone had accepted a weapon from one of his gunmen, a deadly little MAC-10 that could spew out a bajillion bullets in a second or two. He checked it and clipped a strap hanging from it to a ring on his weapons harness. I'm going with you, and you don't have enough time to waste any more of it arguing with me about it. Damn it, he was right. Fine, follow my lead and stay close. We're going to go round up Lord Wraith and get him and everyone else we can out of here before... Marcone abruptly raised his shotgun and put a blast through one of the nearer fallen ghouls that had begun to move. It thrashed, and he put a second shell into it. The ghoul stopped moving. That was when I noticed that the black ichor that spewed from the ghouls was on the ground, and it was moving. By itself. The black fluid rolled and ran like liquid mercury, gathering together into little droplets, then larger globs. Those in turn ran over the floor, uphill in some cases, back toward broken ghoul bodies. As I watched, bits of missing flesh ripped from the ghouls began to fill in again as the ichor returned to their bodies. The one Thomas had beheaded actually came crawling back over the floor, having regained some of the use of its legs. It was holding its head against the stump of its neck with its own hand, and the ichor was flowing from both the severed head and the stump, merging, reattaching it. I saw the ghoul's jaws suddenly stretch and its eyes blink and then focus on me. Holy crap! Time. We didn't have much time. If even the gutted and mangled ghouls could keep getting back up, there was no way the vampires were winning this one. The best they could hope for was to run, and when more vamps ran, more ghouls would be free to overwhelm us. Or possibly, they'd do something even more disgusting than they already had, and we'd all puke ourselves to death. This just can't get much more disturbing, I muttered. Follow me. I gripped my staff in both hands and charged ahead into the mass of maddened vampires and ghouls to save one monster from another. Thank you for listening to Chapter 39. That's kind of scary. They're regenerating. Wonder what's actually causing them to rebuild and regenerate like this. That's something that can't be good. Anyway, thank you guys so very much for liking, subscribing, and sharing, and joining me on this adventure of White Night. Have a wonderful and blessed day.